The feminist icon Shere Hite has died at the age of 77. Best known for her book The Hite Report, a nationwide study of female sexuality, Hite is credited with starting a sexual revolution for women. The book, which was based on the experiences of more than 3,000 women, challenged societal and Freudian assumptions about sex and has sold 48 million copies since it was published back in 1976. Well, we can talk now to Professor Jane Kamensky, who's director of the Schlesinger Library on the history of women in America at Harvard University Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. And thank you so much for joining us here on BBC News, Professor. Let me start by asking you, I have to admit, before I came into work today, I hadn't heard much about Shere Hite. So for viewers who are watching this who are wondering, who was she? Why was she so important for the feminist movement? Can you tell us?
Sure. Shere Hite is somebody you would have heard of if you were watching the news in 1976. The Hite Report, published that year, was a publishing sensation. She claimed to have inaugurated a sexual revolution for women, but in fact, she published into the middle of a sexual revolution, asking Freud's familiar question, as you said, what do women want? But I think for the first time at a mass scale, asking women themselves to respond to that question. And their answers were riveting and surprising, even if they weren't gathered in the best social scientific standards. So I think she had the attention of the world during the peak of her fame from the mid-70s to the early 80s.
She had a lot of attention, but she also had a lot of criticism as well, didn't she? Why was that?
She was in many ways a qualitative researcher passing as a quantitative researcher. The survey was the instrument of choice for knowledge in her day, and she sent out 100,058 question surveys and got more than 3,500 responses back. And she tabulated the responses and said a lot about her method. But in fact, what she was doing was a sort of mass version of consciousness raising, of listening to people tell their stories. So in some ways, she was more of a folklorist than a social scientist. She also got tremendous pushback from men's magazines, most famously Playboy, because she said that men weren't that important to women's sexual pleasure, that's what her female respondents had told her.
What do you think her legacy has been in terms of what she has, done for the feminist movement, for women's ideas about sexuality and female sexuality?
So she's remembered for being a pleasure activist and one of the first. At this hinge moment between the hedonism of the early sexual revolution, the feminist reaction against the sexual revolution, and then the beginning of what we would now call a third wave sex-positive feminist. In fact, I think she's misremembered. She comes down, as she reads the responses in this survey, very equivocal about the sexual revolution, and in fact dubious about the extent to which modern Americans and others she surveyed had put sex at the center of their lives. She calls it almost an opiate of the masses in the late 20th century. So she's remembered as a pleasure activist, but I think she's really quite equivocal about the place of sex in a world that was increasingly suffused with it.
And do you think that the kind of research that she was carrying out then has a place now in today's society, or are we way past that?
So the Schlesinger Library, which I direct, holds all of that original evidence, almost 200 file boxes worth of correspondence and surveys, tabulations. And as a repository of ordinary women telling stories about their private selves at mid-century, it's enormously valuable, even if they're not correctly sampled to represent the whole of the American population. So I think people are going to be doing research in that data, listening to those stories for generations to come.
Okay, Professor Jane Kamensky, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much for taking the time.
You as well, thanks.